It was early December when we got the orders. The four of us had been working in counter-surveillance operations for a while, mostly in cities, tracking high-value targets, gathering intelligence, and making sure threats never reached the public. But this mission was different. It was in the middle of nowhere. The orders were clear. A small group had been operating out of a cabin in a remote forest in Northern Europe, off-grid, unseen, and dangerous. They were involved in something we weren't told about, but it didn't matter. Our job wasn't to ask questions. We were to confirm their presence, assess any security measures, and, if necessary, eliminate the threat. We flew out of a quiet military base, landed at a smaller airfield, and from there it was all ground travel. A single truck took us deep into the forest, where we were dropped off with our gear. From that point, it was all on foot.
No trails, no maps.
Just the coordinates we were given and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The four of us, me, Carter, Levins, and Stokes, moved through the dense forest with trained silence. Snow covered the ground in patches, making every step a balance between staying quiet and keeping traction. The cold was biting, but we were used to worse. By nightfall, we had eyes on the cabin. It was exactly as described, a small wooden structure, no larger than a single-story house, sitting in a clearing. There was a truck parked outside, old but maintained. The chimney let out a weak trail of smoke, barely visible in the freezing air. We spotted one figure through a window moving inside. No other visible movement. We set up camp a few hundred meters away, out of sight. The night passed in shifts, each of us keeping watch, rifles ready. The forest was unnervingly silent, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing too much. At dawn, we made our approach. We circled the cabin, keeping low, watching for tripwires, cameras, anything that would suggest they knew we were there. Nothing. The place was too quiet. It didn't sit right. Stokes, our best shot, took a position covering us from a ridge while the three of us closed in. Carter moved up first, pressing against the wall near the only door. Levins took the back corner. I kept an eye on the windows. Then we heard movement inside. Heavy boots on wooden floors. Then a chair scraping against the floorboards. We froze. Then, just as quickly as it started, the movement stopped.
No voices, no sounds.
Just silence again. Carter signaled. We stacked up at the door. He reached for the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open an inch, then two, just enough to see inside. Darkness. The windows were covered, the light barely seeping through the cracks. I saw a table, a few chairs, a rifle leaning against the wall. Then the smell hit me. Metallic. Stale. Blood. Carter pushed the door open further. The first thing we saw was the body. A man, sitting at the table, head slumped forward, a dark pool beneath him. A gun was on the table in front of him, a single round in the chamber.
Suicide?
We stepped in cautiously, weapons raised, checking every corner. The cabin was small, one room, a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a doorway leading to what was probably a storage space. The walls were bare except for a few maps, pinned up with notes scribbled in a language I didn't recognize. I moved toward the maps. Levins cleared the storage room. Then I heard Levin's breathing changed. Sharper. Alert. I turned. Another body. This one in the corner of the small storage space. Slumped against the wall. Same as the first, head down, blood pooled beneath. Two men. Dead. No signs of struggle. No bullet holes in the walls. Something was off. Levin stepped back, his boot touching something soft. The third body. Three dead men. No signs of forced entry.
No struggle. No defensive wounds.
Just dead. I looked at Carter. He had the same expression I did. This wasn't right. Stokes' voice came through the radio. Movement outside. We froze. Carter signaled toward the windows. I moved first, peering out through a crack in the boarded-up glass. Nothing, just trees, snow, stillness. Then I saw it, a shape too far to make out details. A man standing at the edge of the clearing, just at the tree line. Not moving, just watching. Then he was gone. 1 second he was there. The next he wasn't. I pulled back from the window. My breathing was slow, controlled, but my pulse was hammering. Carter signaled. We had to leave. Levins stepped back into the storage room to check the bodies one last time. Then the sound hit us. A sharp, scraping noise, metal against wood. From beneath the floorboards, all of us turned at once. Came again. Not movement, a dragging sound. Carter yanked Levins back, raising his rifle. I aimed at the floor. Then it stopped. Silence. Levins moved fast, pulling back the old rug covering the wood planks. His gloved hands found the edges of a hatch. A hidden door. We had a choice. Leave, call it in, or go deeper. Carter made the choice for us. He pulled the hatch open. Darkness below. A wooden ladder leading down. A faint smell of damp earth and something else. Something rotten. We didn't hesitate. One by one, we descended. The air was thick, cold. The walls were dirt, packed tight, leading down into a tunnel. It stretched forward just high enough for us to move crouched. Our rifles lit the way. Footprints, old ones, leading deeper. Then the tunnel opened into a small underground space. Wooden beams held up the dirt ceiling. A single lantern, long burned out, sat on a crate, and in the center of the space, a chair, with ropes still tied around it. Whoever had been down here had been restrained. Carter moved forward first. I checked the walls. More maps pinned to the beams. Notes scribbled in the same foreign language. Then Levins muttered something under his breath. He was looking at the ground, at the fourth body. This one was different. Face contorted in a silent scream, eyes wide open, mouth stretched, as if the last moments had been nothing but pure terror.
No wounds.
No signs of violence, just dead. Something felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. Carter pulled out his radio. Static. Then a voice, not ours. A whisper. One word. Run. The radio cut out. We moved. Fast. Out of the tunnel. Up the ladder. Through the cabin. Out into the freezing air. And then we heard it. The sound of something moving beneath the floorboards. Not footsteps. Not human. We ran. Through the trees. Toward the ridge. Toward Stokes. By the time we reached him, he had already seen it. Or what was left of it. The cabin. Burning. Flames rising fast. Consuming the wood. Erasing everything. The bodies. The tunnel. The maps. Everything. Gone. We stood there, catching our breath, watching the fire spread. Then Stokes said it. There was someone else. We turned to him. He shook his head. Not one of us. Someone else was there, watching. He didn't say anything else. We didn't ask. We left. The mission was marked inconclusive.
No survivors.
No intelligence recovered. And we never spoke of it again. Because whatever had been in that cabin, whatever had been watching us, it was still out there. And it had let us leave. I still remember the way the rain felt that night, the cold pressing through my jacket, soaking my sleeves, the wind biting through the trees. The smell of damp earth, wet wood, and pine needles filled the air, thick and heavy. The headlights of my truck barely cut through the darkness as I navigated the narrow, muddy road leading deeper into the woods. The cabin was still a few miles out, and I was already regretting this trip. It wasn't my idea. It was my cousin Mark's. He'd bought the cabin a few years back, a rundown place buried deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. He'd been fixing it up bit by bit, dragging me along when he needed an extra set of hands. It wasn't a bad place, quiet, isolated, but something about it always made me uneasy. Mark couldn't make it this time. His kid was sick, and he didn't want to leave his wife alone to deal with it. I understood, but since we'd already planned the trip, he asked me to go anyway, check on the place, make sure no animals had gotten inside, maybe chop some firewood. I said yes because it was easier than arguing. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the rain had turned the ground into thick, sucking mud. The truck's tires skidded as I pulled up beside the porch, the wipers dragging across the windshield, struggling to keep up with the downpour. The cabin was dark, only the faint outline visible against the trees. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The woods were pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt like a weight pressing down. I flicked on my flashlight, grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The wooden steps creaked under my boots as I climbed onto the porch. The lock was stiff from the cold, but after a few tries, the door swung open with a groan. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and damp fabric. I swept the flashlight over the room, same as I'd left it last time. A few chairs, a table, the wood-burning stove, the narrow cot against the far wall. Everything covered in a fine layer of dust. I set my bag down, shrugged off my wet jacket, and got to work. First, I checked the windows. All locked. No signs of broken glass or animal tracks. I moved to the back door, rattled it to be sure, then did a quick sweep outside with the flashlight. Just trees, rain, and darkness. Back inside, I stacked some wood in the stove and got a fire going. The crackling flames did little to push back the cold, but at least it was something. I pulled a chair close, stretched out my legs, and let the heat soak in. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint but clear over the rain. Something moving outside. I sat up, holding my breath. The wind howled through the trees, branches groaning under the weight of the storm. I told myself it was just that, the wind, the rain, maybe a raccoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, moving toward the window. I kept the beam low, sweeping it across the clearing. Nothing but mud and grass. The truck sat where I'd left it, rainwater streaming down its sides. Beyond that, just the dark tree line. I waited, listening. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I moved back to the chair, but I didn't sit. Instead, I pulled the rifle from where it rested against the wall. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out here, you never knew. I checked the chamber, made sure it was loaded, and set it within reach. The night dragged on, the rain hammering against the roof in waves. I dozed in and out, the fire casting flickering shadows against the walls. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Closer this time. A footstep. I was fully awake in an instant. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it at the window. The beam cut through the glass, illuminating the clearing. And that's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the trees, standing there, not moving. I froze. The flashlight trembled in my grip, the beam wavering. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing something dark. The rain made it hard to see any details, but I could tell they were facing me, watching. I reached for the rifle. My fingers closed around the stock, my heart pounding. I told myself it was a hunter, maybe a lost hiker. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No one came out here, not in the middle of the night, not in a storm like this. I kept the light trained on the figure, waiting for them to move, to call out, to do anything. They didn't. Minutes passed. The fire crackled behind me. The rain drummed against the roof. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned, walked back into the woods. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But I didn't relax. If anything, my grip tightened on the rifle. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, gun in my lap, staring at the door. Every creak, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was over, that whoever it was had left. But that didn't explain why they were here in the first place. The night stretched on, endless. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I was already on my feet, packing my bag. I wasn't staying. Whatever Mark needed me to do could wait. I stepped onto the porch, the cold morning air biting through my clothes. The ground was a mess of mud and rainwater, my boot prints visible from the night before. But as I turned toward the truck, my stomach twisted. There were more prints now, leading up to the porch, stopping just outside the door. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there, standing just feet away while I sat inside, unaware. I didn't wait to think about it. I climbed into the truck, fired up the engine, and tore down the muddy road, not looking back. I never went back to that cabin after that. Mark still owns it, still goes out there when he gets the chance. But I told him if he ever needs anything from it, he's on his own. I didn't want to go. The whole thing was a favor, something I agreed to months back without thinking too much about it. A buddy of mine, Eric, had bought a small cabin way up in the mountains of Washington state, close to the Canadian border. The place was old and falling apart, but he got it for dirt cheap and planned on fixing it up himself. He worked construction, so he knew what he was doing, but he had a tight schedule and could only work on it a little at a time. That's where I came in. He asked if I could check on it while he was away, just to make sure nobody was messing with it. He wasn't worried about squatters, too remote for that. But bears, weather damage, and even small-time thieves could be an issue. The cabin still had some tools inside, and he didn't want them getting stolen. I had some time off work, so I said yes, figuring it'd be a quiet weekend alone. It wasn't. The road up to the cabin was rough, just a dirt path cutting through thick trees, barely wide enough for my truck. It had been raining earlier, and the mud made it slow going. I could hear my tires struggling, spinning a little before finding grip. The trees leaned in close, branches scraping the sides of the truck, and I had to keep my headlights on even though it wasn't dark yet. The canopy was so thick that barely any sunlight made it through. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin sitting there, half-built. The walls were up, but some parts were still exposed to the elements. The roof looked solid, but there was a stack of shingles off to the side, meaning it probably wasn't completely finished. A blue tarp covered part of the structure, flapping slightly in the wind. A small porch had been added, though it was just a frame of unfinished wood, no railings yet. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, taking in the cold mountain air. It was quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just my own breathing and the sound of my boots crunching on wet gravel. The door was unlocked, just like Eric said it would be. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell: wood, dust, and something damp. The floor was covered in sawdust, and a few tools were scattered across a workbench. There was no furniture yet, just a couple of camping chairs and an old mattress on the floor. I dropped my bag near the door and checked my phone. No signal. I wasn't surprised. Eric warned me about that. The plan was simple. I'd stay the weekend, keep an eye on the place, and head back Sunday morning. I had food, water, and a battery-powered lantern. I wasn't worried about anything. That changed the first night. I woke up to a sound outside, a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving through the trees. I sat up, listening. The wind had picked up, making the tarp outside flap louder, but that wasn't what I heard. This was lower to the ground, heavier. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it toward the window. The glass was old and slightly fogged up, but I could see the trees swaying. Nothing else. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe even a bear. I lay back down, but it took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was wet from last night's rain, and I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not boots, not animal tracks, bare feet. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, then stopped near the porch before turning back. The prints were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy. They weren't mine, I checked. Mine had tread marks. These were smooth, naked. I looked around the trees, scanning for movement, but nothing was there. The whole forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I went inside and locked the door, even though the lock was just a simple latch. I wasn't taking any chances. That day I kept busy. I checked the tools, made sure nothing was missing, and even chopped some wood to pass the time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked toward the trees, I expected to see someone standing there. I never did. That night was worse. I had just started dozing off when I heard it again. The sound of something moving outside, but this time, it was closer, right outside the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then something scraped against the wall. Long, slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. The flashlight was next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I listened, trying to figure out what was out there. A thud, then another. It was coming from the porch. I slowly reached for my bag, where I kept my knife. I wasn't planning on using it, but I felt better holding something. Then something tapped the window. Not hard, just a light, careful tap. I couldn't see anything through the fogged-up glass, but I knew someone was standing there, watching me. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife so tightly my hand started to cramp. The tapping came again, softer this time, like whoever was outside wanted to see how I'd react. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then finally the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care what Eric said. I'd tell him someone was messing with the place, and that was that. I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, right outside the cabin, was a pile of rocks. Small, smooth stones, stacked neatly on top of each other. That pile hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me all night. I didn't waste another second. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, the tires slipping on the mud as I sped down the trail. When I finally reached town, I called Eric from a gas station payphone. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You need to leave it alone." "What?" I asked. "Don't go back," he said. "I should have told you before, but the guy who owned that cabin before me, he disappeared, left all his stuff behind. Cops never found him." I hung up without saying another word. I never went back. Neither did Eric. A few months later, he sold the property. I don't know who bought it, and I don't care. All I know is that somewhere, deep in those woods, something is still out there, watching, waiting, and it's not alone. It was late October when I took the job. A man I knew from a few years back, Henry, called me up and asked if I was interested in doing some off-the-book security work for a hunting lodge up in Montana. It wasn't a real lodge, not in the way you'd think. More like an old, run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, owned by some rich guy from out of state who only used it during the peak of hunting season. Henry told me it paid well, way better than my usual gigs, and all I had to do was watch the place for a few weeks, make sure no one broke in, and keep an eye out for trespassers. I'd done work like this before, mostly for vacation homes or empty rental properties. I was used to long nights, isolation, and the occasional troublemaker trying to squat in an empty place. It wasn't anything new to me. What made this job different was the location. This cabin was at least a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, deep in the forest, past miles of dirt roads that barely showed up on a map. The kind of place where if your truck broke down, you were walking a long time before you saw another person. I wasn't thrilled about that part, but the money was good. Too good to pass up. The drive out there was rough. My truck rattled over the uneven dirt road, kicking up dust and loose rocks. I kept looking at my fuel gauge, hoping I wouldn't need to go back into town anytime soon. The trees were dense, towering over the narrow road like they wanted to swallow it whole. It had rained a few days earlier, and I could see puddles and wet patches of mud in the low spots. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. It was a small place, built decades ago but still solid. Thick log walls, a sloped tin roof, a wraparound porch that had seen better days. There was a shed off to the side, its door hanging open slightly, revealing a stack of firewood inside. A rusted old generator sat near the back of the cabin, next to a propane tank that looked like it hadn't been filled in years. I parked my truck, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of old wood and dust hitting me immediately. Inside, the place was simple, a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single bedroom in the back. There were no modern appliances, no TV, and no cell service. A two-way radio sat on the kitchen counter, probably meant for emergency calls if I needed help. I spent the rest of the evening settling in, checking the locks, and making sure everything was in order. There wasn't much to do besides read or sit by the fire, so I took out a book and tried to pass the time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees. The sound of branches scraping against the roof made it feel like something was moving around just outside the cabin. That night, I barely slept. The sounds of the forest were different from what I was used to. Every so often, I'd hear something out in the trees, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But when I looked outside, there was nothing. Just darkness and the shifting silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. The next few days were quiet. I'd walk the perimeter in the mornings, making sure everything was as it should be. The only tracks I saw in the dirt were my own, and the only signs of life were the occasional deer passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On the third night, I heard it, a noise just outside the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something walking, slow and deliberate. Heavy footsteps in the dirt. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight as I listened. Then, a knock at the door. A single knock, followed by silence. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening, my pulse thudding in my ears. Another knock, this time softer. I waited, barely breathing. Then something spoke. A voice, low and broken, like someone trying to force words out of a throat that wasn't meant to speak. "Let me in." I nearly pulled the trigger right there. The voice wasn't normal. It sounded human, but wrong. Stretched, distorted, like a bad recording played back too slowly. I stayed still, gripping the rifle, waiting for whoever or whatever it was to go away. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. Slow, unsteady, something moving back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped outside, rifle ready. The ground outside the door was disturbed. Deep, uneven footprints leading from the tree line to the porch. The prints weren't right. They looked almost human but longer, the toes spread too wide, like whoever made them wasn't used to walking on two legs. I followed them a few yards into the woods before they disappeared. Just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That was when I made my decision. I packed my things, grabbed my gear, and loaded up my truck. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Something was standing at the edge of the tree line. Tall, thin, its limbs too long for its body. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I never took another job like that, and I never went back to that cabin. I had never thought much about my boss's cabin. It sat out in the woods, a good 30 minutes from the main road, and I had only ever been out there once during the daytime. He'd mentioned it a few times at work, how he used it to get away, how he liked the peace and quiet, but beyond that, I didn't care. It was just another cabin in the middle of nowhere. That changed one night when I took the back roads home. I had been working late, later than usual. The office was nearly empty by the time I left. The parking lot quiet except for a few cars that belonged to the night staff. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and a half-eaten sandwich I barely remembered eating. The usual highway home had construction, which meant detours, which meant I could either sit in bumper-to-bumper traffic or take the longer way through the back roads. I chose the back roads. The further I drove, the darker it got. The kind of dark that made the headlights feel useless. The rain didn't help either. It wasn't heavy, just enough to mist up the windshield, make the road slick. I had to drive slower than usual, my tires sliding slightly on the curves. I knew this road. I had taken it before, years ago. It was long and winding, cutting through thick trees on both sides. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just asphalt, rain, and endless black forest. About halfway through, I passed my boss's cabin. It was hard to miss. Even in the rain, I could see the long driveway leading up to it. The cabin itself sat back a ways, tucked behind the trees, but there was a break in the woods where I could see just enough to know something wasn't right. The porch light was on. That was strange. My boss wasn't supposed to be there. He was out of town for a business trip. I knew that for a fact because I had helped him book his flight earlier that week. He wasn't coming back until Sunday, yet the light was on. I slowed the car just a little. The rain pattered against the windshield, my wipers scraping against the glass. I tried to get a better look as I passed. The front door was cracked open. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the strangeness of it. The door hanging open, the porch light spilling out into the night, the knowledge that no one was supposed to be there. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he had forgotten to close it all the way before he left. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, but the wind wasn't strong, and the rain wasn't enough to make it budge. I kept driving. The further I got, the more I felt it, that feeling in my gut. I told myself it was just paranoia, just exhaustion, but something gnawed at me. After another mile, I pulled over. The car idled, rain tapping against the roof. I gripped the steering wheel, thinking I could just keep going. Pretend I didn't see anything. Go home and forget about it. But what if someone had broken in? I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. My boss wasn't a friend, but he wasn't a bad guy either. I had worked for him for years. If someone was in his cabin, if something was wrong, I couldn't just ignore it. I turned the car around. The drive back felt longer. The road seemed darker. My hands were tense on the wheel. When I reached the driveway, I stopped at the entrance, headlights illuminating the path up to the cabin. Nothing moved. I shut the engine off. The rain was lighter now, barely more than a drizzle. I stepped out, gravel crunching under my shoes. The trees loomed on either side, thick and silent. As I walked up the driveway, I kept my eyes on the porch. The light was still on. The door still cracked. The air smelled damp, wood, rain, earth. It was cold. Not freezing, but enough to make my skin prickle. I reached the steps. From up close, the door looked worse than I had thought. It wasn't just cracked open. It was slightly off the hinges, like someone had forced it. The wood around the lock was splintered. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to leave, but I stepped inside. The cabin was dark except for the porch light spilling in. The air smelled stale, like dust and damp wood. The living room was small, just a couch, a coffee table, a few chairs. Everything looked normal. Then I saw the footprints.
Wet footprints.
Leading further inside. They weren't mine. I stood still, listening. The rain against the roof. The wind outside. Then something shifted in the back room. I turned, heart hammering. I could barely see down the hall, but something was there. A shape. I didn't stay to find out. I turned and ran. My feet slammed against the floorboards, the sound echoing through the cabin. I hit the porch steps hard, nearly slipping. The gravel skidded under my shoes as I ran for the car. I didn't look back. I yanked the door open, scrambled inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. I turned it again. Nothing. The rain dripped down the windshield, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I glanced back at the cabin. The porch light flickered. Then, in the darkness of the doorway, something moved. A shadow, a figure, watching me. My breath caught. I turned the key again, harder. The engine roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning, gravel flying. The car jerked as I backed onto the road. I hit the gas. The road blurred past, my hands tight on the wheel. My chest felt like it was caving in, my lungs burning. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station. My hands were still shaking. I called the police. They found the cabin empty. No signs of forced entry.
No footprints.
No one inside. But the door had been broken. And my boss? He never left for his trip. They found his body in the woods behind the cabin. He had been dead for days. It was late October when my cousin and I went to stay in an old cabin in the woods of Northumberland. He had rented it out for the weekend, hoping for a quiet retreat from our usual lives. The plan was simple: hike during the day, relax in the evenings, and enjoy the crisp autumn air. But the weekend turned into something neither of us could have expected. The cabin itself was isolated, deep in a stretch of woodland that barely saw visitors. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and the roads leading up to it were rough and winding. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The place was old, weathered wood, an overgrown path leading to the entrance, and a heavy wooden door that groaned when we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp timber and the lingering smoke of past fires. It was basic but functional: a fireplace, a couple of old chairs, a wooden table, and 2 small bedrooms at the back. No electricity, no running water, just a generator for light and an old pump outside for fresh water. The first night was uneventful. We cooked on the small gas stove, talked about work, family, and the usual things. The wind howled outside, making the trees creak. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside, slow, deliberate steps crunching on leaves. But when I looked through the small window, there was nothing but darkness. The next day, we set off early for a hike. The forest was thick, the ground damp from the night's rain. We followed a narrow path that wound deeper into the woods. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of our boots against the wet earth. After a couple of hours, we reached a clearing with an old stone wall, half collapsed and covered in moss. It looked like the remains of an old building, but there was something odd about it. The ground nearby had been disturbed, as if someone had been digging. We didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just animals. As we turned to head back, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud, not ours, but someone else's. They were deep, suggesting whoever made them was carrying something heavy. They led towards the trees and vanished into the undergrowth. We stood there for a moment, uneasy, before deciding to keep walking. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere felt different. The air inside was colder than it should have been. We had left the door locked, but something felt off. I checked my bag, which I had left on the table, and found it slightly open. Nothing was missing, but the idea that someone had been inside while we were away made my stomach tighten. My cousin laughed it off, saying we were just tired and overthinking things, but I could tell he was just as unsettled. That night, I struggled to sleep. The wind had died down, leaving only silence. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone walking just beyond the cabin walls. I froze, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped near the front door. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No knock, no attempt to open the door. Just the presence of someone standing there, unmoving. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. I stayed awake until morning, every nerve on edge. The next day, we found something that made our blood run cold. Just outside the cabin, near the front steps, was a single boot print large, deep in the damp soil. Whoever had been outside last night had stood there for a long time. And they weren't just passing by. They had been watching. We decided to cut the trip short. Packing up quickly, we locked the cabin and started the long drive back. The entire time, I felt like we were being watched, like whoever had been out there knew we were leaving. A few days later, my cousin called me. He had looked up the history of the cabin. Turns out, a man had gone missing there years ago, a hunter who had never returned from a trip into the woods. His body was never found. We never went back. The rain had started an hour before my shift began, coming down in sheets against the roof of my car as I pulled into the dirt lot. It was a cold, steady downpour, soaking into the earth, turning the narrow road into a thick stretch of mud that made my tires slip as I slowed to a stop. My wipers had been working hard all the way up here, but it was no use. The night was dark, the storm clouds smothering any moonlight, and the only thing guiding me was the faint glow of my headlights bouncing off the wet trees. I worked security for a private construction company. They had been building something out here, deep in the woods, away from any main roads. I never asked what exactly. It wasn't my job to care. My job was to sit in a small, old cabin just outside the site and keep an eye on the place overnight. A few weeks ago, some local kids had broken in, messing with equipment and stealing tools, so the company hired a guard to be here at night. That guard was me. I cut the engine, grabbed my rain jacket from the passenger seat, and took a deep breath before stepping out into the storm. The rain hit me immediately, cold and heavy, soaking through my sleeves before I even reached the trunk. I pulled out my flashlight and work bag, then locked the car behind me. The place was silent, except for the rain drumming against the cabin's roof and the trees swaying in the wind. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a small, one-room structure built decades ago, probably used by hunters back in the day. It smelled like damp wood and old cigarettes inside, and the wind had forced a bit of rain under the door, leaving a dark puddle on the floorboards. I shut the door behind me and set my bag on the rickety wooden table against the wall. The only real source of light was an old overhead bulb connected to the generator, which I had to start manually every shift. I walked to the back of the cabin, flipped the switch, and after a few cranks, the generator sputtered to life. The dull yellow light flickered once, then held steady. I set my flashlight down and took off my wet jacket, shaking off the cold before settling into the chair by the window. The site itself was about 100 yards away, just past the clearing. A dirt path led from the cabin to the construction area, where they were in the middle of putting up some kind of facility. Large metal beams stood half-finished in the muddy ground, scaffolding rising around them like the bones of something that had never fully formed. The whole area was surrounded by a thick tree line, making it impossible to see anything past the site. I had 8 hours to go. The first couple of hours passed without anything unusual. The rain kept falling, steady and heavy, and I sat with my thermos of coffee, watching the trees sway in the wind. The routine was simple: check the area every hour, make sure no one had come snooping around, then go back inside and wait for morning. I had done this shift for 2 weeks already, and nothing had ever happened. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and went out for my first round. The rain had turned the ground into thick mud, and my boots sank slightly with every step. I made my way down the path, shining my light over the site, scanning the equipment and the half-built structure for any movement. Nothing, just the wind and the rain. I circled around the back, my beam cutting through the dark, but there was no sign of anything out of place. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my jacket was soaked through again. I pulled it off, wrung out the sleeves, and sat back down. Another hour passed. The rain didn't let up. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the storm, a rustling sound coming from the trees behind the cabin. I turned in my chair, listening. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but something about it felt off. It was too deliberate, too steady, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up. I walked to the window, peering out into the dark. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches dripping with rain, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I waited, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved erratically, stopping and starting. This was different, slow, careful steps pushing through the wet leaves and mud. I reached for my radio, but there was no one to call. I was alone out here.
No backup.
No one on the other end of the line. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the door. The cold hit me immediately. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, sending rain sideways into my face as I stepped out onto the porch. I shined my light into the woods, sweeping it back and forth. Nothing. I took a step forward, my boots sinking into the mud. The wind carried another sound this time, something deeper. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the wet ground. I took another step. The beam of my flashlight shook slightly in my grip. I swept it across the tree line again, my breath coming out in quick, cold puffs. Then I saw it. A figure, just past the trees. It was standing completely still, half hidden by the branches. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my pulse hammering. The wind howled around me, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, the figure took a step back, and another, and then it was gone, swallowed by the trees. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, my light still pointed at the empty space where it had stood. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm? I forced myself to move, stepping back onto the porch, my eyes never leaving the trees. I went inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the window watching, but the figure never came back. Morning finally came, the rain slowing to a drizzle as the sky lightened. My shift was over. I waited until the construction crew arrived before stepping out of the cabin. The site manager gave me a nod as he walked past, but I barely heard him. I was still thinking about the night before. I made my way to my car, glancing once more at the tree line before getting in. Whoever had been out there, they had wanted me to see them, and that thought stayed with me long after I had left the site behind.